All right. Good afternoon for some of us and our West Coast folks. Good morning to you. So excited that you are attending today's webinar. This is kind of the first one that we've done in a while for Age Lead Store. And so super excited to have such a response and so many folks attending. Today, we're here to talk about lead generation with drip email campaigns. And just kind of an initial disclaimer that's super important when we're talking about email in particular, and then as we kind of associate with age leads. So as you can see, I'm giving this webinar in partnership. I actually own a marketing agency, Kaleidico, and doing this in partnership with Age Lead Store. I work with Age Lead Store on the marketing side of things and sales enablement. All of your questions related to age leads would be directed to Troy. He can talk about pricing. He can talk about the different types of data. We can answer, or I can answer some questions, maybe about age leads and data. But today, this presentation's main focus is really to talk about drip email campaign strategy. And we're not necessarily applying it directly to any type of a lead or customer source of data. Around data, there's always a variety of rules and regulations, which I suggest that you lean on your organization and your affiliations to kind of really get the authoritative stance on that, or just do your own research with the appropriate regulations and those sorts of things. So I'm not today giving you any sort of legal guidance or advice, but I am kind of showing you how to use campaigns, email campaigns specifically in the context of having kind of the appropriate regulatory, following all the guidelines and those sorts of things. So I'm just showing you email campaign techniques to figure out kind of how and when you can apply it to which sorts of data and customer records. That's something that you should rely on your own source of legal counsel. So just to kind of reinforce that legal disclaimer there, super important. So anyway, let's jump in. A couple of just administrative things. I am watching the chat area, and I'm also monitoring Q&A. We're going to ask some questions along the way in this webinar. And so would love for you to load that up with questions so that we can just make this more personalized. And obviously, you came to the webinar with some questions. I will probably create some questions in your mind. So I'd love to make this as interactive as possible. This is what we're going to cover today. First and foremost, I think it's important to understand why I love drip email and why I teach this topic and get pretty passionate about it. Number two, I'm going to talk about changing your mindset. I think a lot of times people come into email marketing with the wrong mindset or the wrong goals. And that actually limits their success with email. And I see from our poll that I asked earlier, how many are currently using drip email campaigns? It looks like most of our audience, about 70% of the audience, is not using drip email or are not using drip email campaigns at this point. So definitely want you to go into this particular marketing tactic with the appropriate mindset. Then we're going to talk about what to keep track of. And then we're going to start to get very specific. I'm going to show you some real examples of how to write better emails. And then I've got a get tactical section. That's where we're going to kind of talk about the mechanics. I get a lot of questions around the individual, like what software to use, what kind of timing to use, and those sorts of things. So I'm going to cover some of those tactical things, next steps, and then we're going to open it to Q&A. So again, any questions, throw them in the Q&A, and I'm happy to kind of talk through those. Let me get my chat window back up so I can see you guys. Oh, I have Matthew says he can't hear the audio. Do I have anybody else that has audio problems? If you can hear my audio, let me know in the chat box that you can hear audio, just in case this is... Okay, Z, I see an all good. Matthew, this might be on your side. Olivia, I'm getting an all good. Zach can hear me. So Matthew, maybe tweak your audio settings. Maybe have something on mute. So sounds like we're still in good order. So I'm going to keep pushing through. Matthew, hopefully someone can help you with that, or you can get it going. If not, we're recording all this and we'll be able to get this on the replay. Okay, so why do I love drip email? I'm going to lead every section with a little bit of a question for you. So I'd love to hear why you're interested in drip email campaigns. And then, of course, we kind of already asked this polling question, but are you currently using any sort of email automation in your sales process? I'd love to hear those two questions answered. Okay, so this is why I love it. It gives me scale. I know a lot of you, just even from looking at your names and some of the interactions that we've had through kind of the email list, a lot of you are smaller or individual agents or loan officers. And as a result, you're often competing against larger entities than yourself. And so email is a great way to give you scale and competitive sort of leveling between you and the big folks. You can get that scale without additional overhead. So you don't have to necessarily, a lot of our businesses in insurance and mortgage are kind of built around adding bodies in order to get more originations or more policies written. But email can really help you be efficient as an individual producer and give you that scale without having to add those additional bodies or the complexity of actually creating an agency or becoming an actual lender. Maximizes the ROI across all of your different activities. So by getting a system in place that uses email, you're going to be able to get more return on your marketing dollars. Any leads that you buy, leads can then sort of live forever. Once you've acquired those leads, either you're generating them through your website, or perhaps you're buying them in real time, or even doing something like age leads, or maybe some data buying itself. Those leads will constantly, once you've kind of got them in your system, can potentially continue to return over not days, but actually months and years. And then, of course, your sales process. The more that you use automation in your sales process, the more sales activity that's going to actually be happening without you physically having to be on the phone or in front of the computer. So there's just such scale is a huge piece of this. And then, of course, once you have a system, and I'm going to be talking a lot about creating a system, and it goes right to your point, Zach, here, you're interested in learning to leverage your time by working smarter than harder. That's what a system does for you. And ultimately, once you build out this system, of which email can be a critical piece of it, it's kind of the closest things to making money while you sleep. That's kind of not the perfect. It doesn't ever happen perfectly like that. There's a lot of work that needs to be done in preparing the system and actually caring and feeding and managing and tweaking and optimizing the system. But it is very efficient once it's set up. So the first thing you have to do, I think, is to actually change your mindset. So many of you, actually, let's pause for a question here for a second. What should email campaigns, this is kind of to set you up for this, what should email campaigns help you do in your mind right now? What do you think email is going to do for you? And what do you think the primary goal of email campaigns are? Go ahead and throw that in there. What do you think kind of the primary goal of an email campaign should be? You guys are shy. All right. Grab someone's attention. Yep, love that. Get their attention. See a lot of that. Okay, so this kind of goes to the point of why did I call the webinar lead generation with drip email? I think oftentimes people think of email as actually a way to create new sales or actually close sales. And I think this is what causes a lot of poor email experiences for customers. This is where you get into kind of the spam context of email. Email doesn't have to feel like spam if you change your priority. If your priority is not to close the deal, but rather to sort of get their attention, like you said, create a relationship. I love that, Mike. Nurturing a relationship or generating a lead. Even if you've purchased a real-time lead, when you're actually building out your email campaign and you're talking to that new lead, really what you're trying to do, because oftentimes that lead generation is done in a general context from some larger lead generation brand, you essentially have to introduce that individual to your brand and sort of regenerate the lead. So lead generation to me is that resetting of your goal with email marketing. So you will write better emails, you will write less sort of friction in the email process when you're writing to the customer in a way that you're trying to build a relationship or you're trying to initiate them to engage directly with you. Just creates a better email experience. So ultimately, you want to stop trying to close the deal with email. You have to understand that when you're doing email, and this is where drip helps you to kind of understand this, if you're dripping against a database or a list or a customer individually, you're actually trying to build awareness over time for your brand. You're trying to build relationship and trust with you individually. And all of that mindset goes into building kind of better emails. So here's kind of the only silver bullet I have to give you today, and I think it's a really important one, and that is a good process always beats a great template. I know even in speaking with you guys, often I get asked for, hey, give me your template. I want your template. And ultimately, having a process, having a system that actually takes that lead in, runs them through a campaign or a process, and making sure that you have prepared yourself to greet that lead and to take automation or action against every different scenario is going to be so much better than having kind of the perfect pre-written template, because by building that process, you'll always be addressing the customer's need as it comes forward, and you'll actually be anticipating that so that you're prepared for those kind of different little forks in the road that the client will have as you guys kind of move through the process. All right, so before we get into kind of the nitty gritty of things, there's always the question of like, what should I be tracking to understand whether or not this is actually working for me, whether or not email is producing the results that I want to get, and to give me kind of the little things along the way to help me understand whether I need to tweak something or whether I need to optimize something. So kind of a question, and again, this will go to some things that we'll talk about later. Those of you who are doing drip email or using email marketing in any sort of context, tell me what you're using to send your emails today. Are you sending them sort of directly out of your email? Are you actually using some sort of software? Give me sort of a list of the tools that maybe you've used or you're thinking about using, and then potentially I can talk specifically about some of those later. And then ultimately, I'm kind of curious as to what you use to track your performance. Okay, so this is what I focus on targeting as far as the monitoring and the metrics go. Open rate is critical. That is really the only way you're even going to get an opportunity is to have that open rate. And so along with what you're tracking, it's important to understand kind of what actually impacts that. What would you optimize in order to increase that number or improve that result? So I'm tracking open rate. That's 100% controlled by subject line. And so often, especially when I'm kind of looking at emails for folks and they're saying, hey, take a look at this and what would you change or what would you optimize? I can't tell you the number of times I get examples sent to me that just don't have a subject line. And so I can't really evaluate any sort of template if it doesn't have a subject line. And too often we sit down and we write emails and we don't really think about the subject line, or we don't sort of go through enough iterations to kind of really tune up that subject line. And that is the gatekeeper to email. Much like on the phone, you're trying to get through gatekeepers sometimes, or you're trying to kind of get to the right spouse who makes the decisions. This actual subject line is the kind of the mechanism to get through and even get an opportunity to build a relationship or to get a response. So open rate, response rate, that's actually them responding to you. This does not count any sort of bounces or undeliverables that you'll get. You're just going to get that naturally. Don't ever add that into your response rate calculation. But true response rate, people that are answering you either positively or negatively, is critical because you want both. Kind of the worst scenario you can have is an email that goes out that gets no response. So you don't know if this thing is still alive, if there's still an opportunity, or if it's just kind of went to the wrong part of their inbox, went to to spam. When we have Gmail, they have all those different tabs. It could have gone into promotions or something like that. So the worst context is to get no feedback, positive or negative. We don't care, because if I get negative feedback or positive, I can start to optimize things. I can start to change things up. And so when we're looking at response rate, we're looking at body copy, and potentially we're looking at content. So oftentimes I like to actually send them to content, or potentially give them a link to some deeper content. And you're going to see some examples of that. That's what kind of inherently helps response rate, is the body copy and the content that you've included. And then the third thing I track is how do responses convert to qualified leads. So the other thing that I may need to tune in my body copy is I may be getting a lot of responses, but I'm getting the wrong kind of responses, or getting responses for people that just aren't qualified. And so with my body copy inside of my emails, I can start to sort of precondition or pre-qualify some of the new leads that I'm getting in, because sometimes it makes a lot of sense to kind of filter through those leads and not necessarily get all responses, or at least get productive responses. And you can kind of see some examples. So I come out of the mortgage industry. And in the mortgage industry, we like to do a lot of pre-qualification. And there are some things that people can do that actually can better prepare them to be a better client or a better lead. And so we'll show you some examples of how I've kind of done that in my mortgage business. Ultimately, whenever we're constructing an email, anywhere along that process, anywhere along the campaign, this is kind of the most lost piece. And you're actually going to see some examples of my emails where I kind of violate this or entirely violate this. I would not suggest straying from this very often. Every email should have one goal and only one goal. And so I'm going to show you some of the emails where I kind of break this rule. But should you break the rule? Probably not. All right, so let's get into the brass tacks. And again, start to load up questions in the Q&A, because we're going to hit that here in about 20 minutes or less. Okay, so how to write better emails. So again, in the chat area, I'd love to know how many of you have actually written an email campaign, just kind of set in a document and built out all the emails and then plugged them into your software. And if so, what part of that process do you find the hardest? Is it the subject line? Is it the body copy? Is it just actually kind of thinking logically through that dialogue flow? Give me some insight, those of you who have actually kind of worked on this, what you think is the hardest part. In my mind, and where I spend the most time is on subject lines. Oh, Z, that's an excellent one. The length of the message, we're going to talk about that here in a second. So how long should your emails be? Long, short, there's a lot of debate on that. And that's one of those sort of testing things. So we're going to talk about that. But to me, subject lines are everything, and they're often the most forgotten about. So again, a lot of times if people are writing out a campaign, or I help them with the campaign first, I will see a whole bunch of emails, and then in some cases they completely leave off the subject line entirely. Whereas when I'm building a campaign, oftentimes I'm writing 3 or 4 subject lines before I land on the one that I'm going to use. And so just kind of that iterative process of going through the subject line, because that's what's going to get their attention. And that's where you also have to, if you've ever done this before, or you've ever kind of been in the marketing part of the game, you want to sort of take your marketing speak out of there. If you've done like things like landing pages and you've done call to actions and stuff like that, doing that in an email and doing that in a subject line is actually kind of the worst thing you can do. So there's a different sort of process by which you write a subject line with an email than probably anything you've done in any other sort of marketing capacity, whether that's Facebook or display ads or ad text on Google AdWords, website copy and that sort of thing. This is really kind of its own genre, and subject lines are much different and should be written much different than typical sort of marketing campaign. So here's some of the general guidelines. I have a long list of these. These are just a few that are kind of my current favorites, because these are the ones that I see the most mistakes when I'm looking through clients' work. We want to be as specific as possible. So really think through, and oftentimes when I'm building out a campaign, the first thing I'll actually do in my outline is outline all of the particular scenarios of where leads might come from. So the source of those leads. So if I'm buying leads, I will have a separate sort of campaign for inbound real-time leads. And then if I'm talking about mortgage, I'll break those down to refinance or purchase. I really want to kind of understand the context of how that lead is coming into me, and then talk specifically to them. So as specific as I can get in segmenting my inbound leads or my data, even if we're talking about old data that's sitting in your database, so people that you've talked to before or past clients or those sorts of things, understanding who they are so that you can be as specific as possible in the subject line is super critical. Be conversational. You want these to have the appearance of as personal as possible in email. So think more like sending an email to your friend or sending an email to a client that you've had a lot of contact with and they know who you are. That's kind of the way you want these emails to be. Now, don't overwork the subject line. Do it in such a way that it appears conversational and it feels like you just kind of threw it out, even though you're going to work harder than that. This is kind of the key point there. Write like a friend, not a marketer. Again, think about how you would actually send this email to a friend. Minimize punctuation. Sometimes people get, very kind of like, their English class. They put all the appropriate punctuation, or they put too much punctuation. Exclamation points are the death of email subject lines because it in and of itself is a flag, right? And so you got to be careful with that. Some people are starting to use emojis. I've seen positive and negatives to that. But generally, if you look through your email inbox, and this is where I get a lot of cues, and you look at the types of emails that our friends are sending you, you notice that they probably don't use emojis. They probably don't use any sort of punctuation. And they're probably relatively short and to the point as to why they're contacting you. No camel case. This again is a sure flag that a marketer or a salesperson is sending you an email, is somebody that capitalizes every single word. So that looks more like a headline or maybe a call to action on a website. And so that's kind of their classic marketing training that's filtering in there. So it's a sure flag that you're getting an email that's from someone who's trying to sell you something or market to you. Don't be too clever. So don't try to kind of make too many clever either tricks or jokes or gimmicks in your subject line. Again, sometimes we can out clever ourselves, and then it just sort of signals to them that, hey, this is somebody that's trying to market or sell to me. Again, this is what I said before, maybe 5 to 6 is too many, but at least 3 or 4 different subject lines before you kind of land on the one. Just sort of iterate through those, and you're going to get to something that's a little more refined, a little more clear, and probably a little tighter. And then I like to reinforce branding. You're going to see some examples of this. Some people try to hide that they're actually there as a company or as a broker or as a loan officer. I actually kind of like to have that, and I think it builds trust and honesty up front, is to signal to them that, no, this is coming from my company. This is coming from Velocity Lending. This is coming from, XYZ insurance broker. And I'll show you how sometimes I do that branding. And to me, it just seems kind of a more honest way to have that initial conversation. And then it also helps them to search and reinforce that. So again, this can be tested. I've had a lot of success with this, but I know some people would probably not do this. All right, here's some of my favorite tricks and some of the subject lines that are actually running in existing campaigns that I've done. And I've kind of broken them down into categories so you can take a look at how I actually build a subject line. One of my favorite sort of tricks or techniques is using assumptive language. So depending on the type of data source that I'm using and maybe the recency of conversation that I've had with these individual clients and customers, I like to go in with the assumption that we're working together, or that we're following up on something that I know that you've done. So if this is a lead, an internet lead, and that sort of thing, I know, especially with real-time leads or even sort of age leads, I know that they probably talked to several different people and they made an inquiry for a mortgage or for a life insurance quote. So I know that about them. I know that they made that inquiry, and I know that that's what they're looking for. So my first email should simply acknowledge that fact and check in on them and see if they've accomplished that goal. And so this is often one of the first emails that I sent. And sometimes this goes along with phone calling. You should definitely be using different techniques altogether. You should be emailing, and you should be calling, you should be leaving voicemails, all of this in kind of an integrated way. But you can see this is where the technique of kind of using so whatever my actual company or maybe my individual agency name is, I like to reinforce that. And I just put it in these square brackets. So this isn't actually this is actually how I do it. So for my mortgage company, I would put in square brackets velocity lending. And then I would say, did you get your mortgage? So that they know, hey, this is from me. I am truly a lender. And you asked for some information about a mortgage. And I'm just checking to say, hey, did you get it? Acknowledging the fact that there's going to be several of us talking to you. Sometimes that's overwhelming for them. And this little question and you sort of asking permission to kind of come into their world gets a good response. And you can do the same thing with insurance. You know, did you get your life insurance quote? And again, acknowledging who I am. They're going to have so many people come into their inbox where they're going to try to be clever or sneaky. Sometimes this is a really refreshing way to kind of enter the conversation. So something that I've had a lot of success with. The other thing that I've had a lot of success with is when whenever I have any sort of lead source, even if I'm using age data in my database or past clients or whatever, I always like to, if at all possible, initiate a call first. And then use a follow-up email message. So even on my call or my voicemail, I always say, hey, I'll be following up with a quick email with all my contact information. Look for that email. And so when I do that, this kind of email is super effective. And this is just, in the first example, this is how you can do some personalization depending on what's in your database. I'm just going to tell them, hey, Susie, I tried calling. And again, if you've had that voicemail, and now it's really great if you do this well, voicemail is actually translated to text. And so they probably read it, even if they haven't listened to it. And this gets really high open rates. And so this is a way to really kind of activate these email campaigns and could be a good starting point. Same thing, you can also do this if you don't have the personalization data, you don't have the first name. Again, you can use your brand name and then sort of start the question process. And again, invite sort of yourself into the conversation. Lost to a competitor, this is another one that I think is a missed opportunity that I've had a lot of success with. If they actually tell you, maybe you have a conversation or you've had an email, and again, this is all automation, and they tell you that, hey, no, I'm going to go with somebody else, or I'm already taken care of. I usually like to send another campaign with a couple emails. And here's actually 2 emails in a row that I tend to send. So the first one is I acknowledge the conversation that they've either told me through email or maybe on a phone call. Hey, I'm sorry that I lost you to a competitor, because I want them to have my contact information. Because one thing that we know, both in the insurance and mortgage industries and all kinds of industries, by the way, a lot of times once somebody sort of initiates or gets the green light to sort of get the deal, they often fall down in the actual process of getting to serving the client. So a lot of times we have a really good sales system, but that onboarding system is really messy. Or if you're in the mortgage industry, I assume insurance is kind of a similar way. That originations process involves some other people, maybe some other carriers, or processors, and sometimes things get screwed up. So I like to stay in the game during that process, because over the next 10 to 20 days, there's a good possibility that whoever they initiated the conversation with fails them. And so this keeps you in the game and an opportunity to kind of pick up anybody that your competitor drops on the ground or starts to frustrate. Just sort of staying in a really nice way, just kind of checking in on them and showing them what great service you can provide can often get you into a really high win-back rate. Process driven, don't forget. So the same reason that you can win deals is the same way that you can lose them. As you start to get into that origination process, or you start to get into that process of securing that policy, make sure that you have some automation in place to stay top of mind and to assure them that they are moving through some process so that you don't actually get taken advantage of by a competitor because your process, after you get that, hey, yeah, I want to go with you, starts to get messy. And some of that just is going to happen because of a variety of reasons, or maybe the customer's got a little bit of a messy situation, but make sure that you have a process-driven. And so here's some subject lines that I use in that process-driven thing. And you can kind of, again, mortgage, again, more familiar with this, but there's a real big danger zone here as they're looking for a home in the purchase scenario. And this is some of the way you can see some of the kind of the techniques I use to stay on top of that process and not to let a kind of a realtor sort of take it away from me or switch mortgage brokers or whatever, just with some real personal sort of messages like, hey, send me the pictures of what you're looking at. Lets me know that they're moving forward in the process, keeps us in communication, and again, kind of keeps us top of mind. Okay, so that's subject lines. Body copy is actually what converts. So once you've gotten that open and you've had success there, the body copy is what starts to the process of converting. So let me take you through some body copy. All right, so here's an example. Again, a lot of my experiences in mortgage, but you can probably see, or you can ask some questions about how to convert this to insurance, because I know we got a lot of insurance agents and brokers on with us today. But again, a lot of the principles are similar as I kind of go through here. So this is a refinance sequence that I use. So you can, again, this is sort of the first email that they get. If I originated this on my own site or I purchased the lead, just acknowledging the process that they've been through. Hey, I'm one of the people that that are going to be able to help you. I want to make sure that, again, without being clever or tricky, I want to make sure that they're clear who I am, who I work for. So all of that helps and gets credibility. I like to put in a link to the website at some point so they can kind of check us out. This can be a big differentiator, especially in the insurance industry. A lot of times individual agents don't have web pages, or they can be hard for them to find because it's associated with maybe a larger, like a State Farm or something like that, or an Allstate, and you may have a landing page, but sometimes that doesn't rank. And so giving them a link so they can kind of check you out, that really kind of solidifies or starts to solidify the trust in the relationship. So don't make them hunt around for it. The worst thing you can do is actually have them go search for you and them not be able to find you. So help them with an introduction, with a link to the page so that they can kind of be confirmed that you're legitimate and you have a web presence, which is so important these days. Acknowledge how you got their information. This is super important. There's different ways to do this depending on the data sources that you're using, and we can kind of talk through those if you have any questions about that. And then giving them kind of the value proposition, what I can do for you, making it clear. And this is kind of a broker approach. In this case, is I can do the shopping for you, versus, you're going to go up against lenders. So try to kind of block off the competitors, whoever you compete with. Try to have a value proposition here, why you want to go with me, why I'm different. That's super important. A lot of times, again, you can add some additional information. I'm trying to get that initial response, click through, anything that is going to, in their email system, show that I'm a welcome email is super critical in that first. So as many opportunities as I can to get them to interact with me or to reply to me is so important. So rates is a big thing. Even though somebody's potentially kind of done some of that rate shopping, showing them today's rates often gets a big click, even if they've already gone through that process. There's just something magical about check today's rates that people love to click on that. So that's a little trick for mortgage. And then the other thing is I like to land with a question so that I can hopefully get a reply. If I can get a reply to my email, that just assures me into their inbox for the rest of my campaign. And so oftentimes you can see that I'm trying to get some sort of response, some sort of reply to that email in all cases. Email number 2, the first one was a little bit longer. I have more information to communicate. Number 2, I start to sort of keep it super short. So this goes to kind of your question early on. Who was that? I think it was from Zach, about kind of the length of emails. And so the length of email varies. I play with this. Generally, I like it to be as short as possible. Again, sort of simulating what you would get from a friend. And so you're always kind of blending the professional nature of the email with kind of making it feel like a personal and something that was actually typed by that individual to you specifically. So the best we can do at sort of personalizing and making it look like something that I just sort of quickly typed up for you. Something like this, although probably necessary for most first emails or somewhere in the sequence, it's going to be obvious to them that this was kind of done in a systematic way. So generally, I would favor these kind of emails because it feels like I shot you a quick email. And so this is kind of the third in the sequence. This one, again, I've had a lot of success here because as you've gone through 3 of these, a lot of times in your mind, you're assuming I've emailed them 3 times. They certainly must have done something different, but oftentimes they haven't. They just either have been overwhelmed with the process or just haven't had a chance to get to it, or for whatever reason, just simply haven't seen it. And so an email like this is sort of taking the deal away from them or giving them the feeling that you're sort of giving up on them. And a lot of times I will get a response out of this third email. So did you get approved? If they didn't get approved, they might be in a tiny bit of a panic. It's like, oh, wait a second. Like, I don't have an approval. I haven't gone through this process. And sort of acknowledging that, hey, they might have gone with someone else and that you're in business, for the long haul. You've got lots of clients and you're just trying to kind of sort through that. Again, you kind of trigger that FOMO, that fear of missing out. And by sort of taking the deal away from them, a lot of times you'll get some sort of response that says, no, I'm just, not thinking about it right now. Or, I was working on, hadn't been a priority, or we're trying to figure out what we're going to do or something like. So I will often get sort of by telling them that you're going to go away, you'll often get your best responses out of that sort of final, I'm getting ready to leave sort of email. So that's a good little technique. All right, so this again goes towards the message length, the Z, and so you can see that I use long and short, and I'm always kind of testing. I actually had a fair amount of success, or have a fair amount of success with this particular one. Again, rates is a big trigger in the mortgage industry, maybe insurance as well, sort of pricing. And then this is actually a purchase sequence that I use. Oftentimes, this is an example too of sort of qualifying my lead. So you can see from this email that I am interested in generating a lead, a qualified lead, because I actually kind of take them through the process. I acknowledge the fact, and again, this is mortgage specific, but you can sort of refit this to insurance. And that is, hey, if you're going to purchase a home, you need a pre-approval, right? And you need to start looking for a home. One of the kind of biggest processes that I try to overcome with an email like this is in the purchase process. Oftentimes people will get pre-approved, but they'll just kind of like get lazy or sit around and they don't actually go looking for a home. I don't know what it is, but I'm often having to kind of push people in to start looking for a home. So by using this little technique, by sending them to Zillow or sending them to realtor.com, I'm kind of invoking that next step to get them to start looking for homes. And then the other thing that helps me qualify leads, and this probably also works for insurance, is I want them to take a look at their credit score, because oftentimes that helps me in that process. One, when I start to talk to them, I'll get a better and more accurate estimation of what they think their credit score is. And they'll also have started to set their own expectations for what they might actually qualify for. And so this is this whole PS in this email specifically designed to qualify a better lead for me. Yeah, Mike, we are recording this and it will be available post webinar for you guys to consume. So we'll shoot that out via the email list that we have here. So hopefully everybody's enjoying it. Again, start loading up to questions because we're going to go over to questions here in just a very few minutes. And then, of course, this is the short. I like to throw in like super, super short emails just to test or to break things up. Sometimes my first one will be this short. This takes a lot of discipline because I think most people are fearful of writing the short email, but sometimes I get my best responses because they feel personal. And so definitely put some of this in your sequence and you will be amazed at what a little email like this will do for you. This is also a technique that I like to use on past clients or old data in my database. So if I purchased some leads and for whatever reason we just never connected and they just went unresponsive, this is a great way to reactivate unresponsive leads. It's just to kind of check in on them. Did you ever get your pre-approval? Did you ever get your home? Are you still looking? Again, just sort of begs a response here, and it's super quick. Looks like you just kind of typed it out real quick and shot it off to them. Warming up cold leads. So here's a couple of examples of how I like to warm up, again, either old unresponsive leads in my database or things that we just kind of consider to be cold. And again, it's acknowledging the process, right? Did you get the mortgage? I know that you went online and you actually requested to get some mortgage rate quotes. Did you get that? So simply showing them in the email that you know the process that they've been through and you just kind of checking in on them can be super effective. Of course, asking them to hit reply, giving them phone numbers, making it easy for them. A lot of times, and again, this happens for insurance and mortgage, I think, is just over time, it makes sense to kind of recheck where you are. So I like to use the PS. PS is a great way. Some of your best activation, your best actions take place in the PS, is just to give them a place to kind of, okay, like I did do my mortgage or I did get an insurance quote, but maybe I should check again. Again, if you're warming up some old data, this is a great way to just get them to sort of check in and see whether or not their rate, their current rate or their current payment is kind of the best deal. If you do have that kind of functionality in your websites, that can be super effective. And then over here, again, if I'm warming up some cold data, a lot of times a phone call is a good first step. And then again, I'm going to leave lots of voicemails. This is the perfect companion to a voicemail. Hey, I'm going to be following up with an email that has all my contact information. If you ever need me, it'll be in your inbox. And then again, following up with this automation so that happens together and they have that in there. This is super productive too. And also make sure, I haven't included my signature block because it's by default in all my campaigning software, but make sure you have a good full signature block. So your name, your phone number, your email, make sure that's on every single email because so often people will actually search for you or search for kind of the emails you sent. And a lot of times I'll get a response out of somebody weeks after I've actually sent the email. So here's some other examples of kind of how to warm up the cold leads. Again, acknowledging the process that they could be going through or the stage that they might be at, and some different ways that I can help. Of course, I can answer questions, even if you're going through with somebody else. Did you go in a different direction? Like, acknowledging the fact that it's okay if you went with a competitor, just let me know. So there's a couple of other examples of cold lead warm-ups. Okay, so let's get super tactical and then we're going to go into questions. All right, so again, this is your time to load up the questions and answer. Otherwise, we won't, I won't be able to personalize it as much as possible at the end. So if I've created any questions in your mind, please throw that in there. And we can get very tactical about your specific situations as well. Okay, so first and foremost, if you're going to do email campaigning, it probably makes sense to be cautious with your primary email. So one technique, especially if you're going to use email automation software, is to often set up a closely associated domain that you can use for email campaigning, because invariably there's a good chance, especially if you're new at this, you might make people upset, and that could trigger some spam complaints and those sorts of things. And just prepare yourself. People are going to be irritated, even if they requested the information, even if they gave you permission to email them, even if they said, hey, please give me a rate quote. Hey, please give me information. A lot of times they're in a process of doing that with multiple places online or multiple providers, and they sort of create their own problem in that they have lots of people pile into them. And so sometimes out of frustration and sort of being unaware of how much contact that can create on them, they'll just kind of get nasty. So just make sure that you're using something closely associated. A lot of times I'll go with your brand and maybe a .co or .io or something like that. Again, something closely associated, but probably makes sense, especially if you're going to use automation software, that you use a separate email, because you, of course, don't want to be able to be in a situation where your primary email gets blocked and you can't service clients. Use automation. Here's a few of my favorites. I've kind of got these broken down. On the left side is strict email campaigning software. These are two of my favorites. I use Mailshake probably the most. On the right, these are two of my favorite CRMs. They're sort of non-specific to a particular vertical. A lot of times you will have insurance specific or mortgage specific CRM. I'm actually inclined not to do that. And so I like to use kind of a more generic CRM. I also manage multiple businesses. So this helps me build. These more generic CRMs tend to have sort of better email functionality than a lot of the industry specific. But again, a lot of times this is driven by your organization. You might not have control over this. And then Zapier is a great way to kind of wire all these things together. Zapier is a little piece of software that does a lot of integrations without you having to be technical. And so that has a lot of advantages to it. Now, a couple things I want to mention here, because in the chat box, I've gotten some of the things you guys are using. Allstate e-agent, that's awesome. You can use that. You may want to campaign outside of that if you need sort of more functionality, or if that's even allowed, I don't know. One thing that I see in here that I would not suggest for drip email campaign, it's a great way to nurture long-term campaigns and list. Things like Constant Contact, MailChimp, you'll notice that's not on my list. That's super appropriate for kind of sending out like an ongoing reoccurring news list. But for putting in kind of newly acquired leads or potentially warming up or campaigning against your database, where that data might have aged over time or might start to be inaccurate, Constant Contact and MailChimp and things like that are going to be frustrating to you, because a lot of times you'll get a high number of bounces because you probably haven't been actively engaging with those customers. And so a lot of that information will be old or potentially inaccurate for a variety of different reasons. So I would suggest, if you are going to use software like that, always use something like Bright Verify to clean the data as much as possible. But probably is not kind of the first step. Even using something like a MailChimp or a QuickMail, which actually uses and simulates sort of manual sending. So you can, I'm going to talk about kind of the amount of sending that happens here. This simulates you kind of manually doing this activity. These two pieces of software, Constant Contact and MailChimp, just as a massive bulk blast. And that's really not what you want to do with drip email campaigns and this type of tactic. That's more for ongoing relationships and just kind of staying top of mind with a newsletter. So just a caution there. Infusionsoft can definitely be a great way to go, especially depending on what your industry. Again, it's one of those generic sort of things and allows you to build a lot of kind of interesting logic around the customer's behavior and the different twists and turns they take as they start to respond to emails and potentially interact with web pages. That can be really effective. So, so those are just a couple that I see in the chat. If you've got more, let me know. Okay, so here's another one. Whether you're using any kind of these software, I think that sort of get my answers going here. Okay, so this is really important. Don't get greedy. So that's why I was talking about with Constant Contact and MailChimp. That's kind of the greedy approach where you're just blasting a bunch of people and you're trying to get, one, you can overwhelm your process, especially if it's just one person there. But the other thing is you can burn down an email really quick if you get you don't have, you haven't cleaned your data, or you're just kind of blasting out massively, you can kind of get yourself in trouble here. So I would generally, sometimes even if you're doing some initial testing, you might even just use your templates in your 3 or 4 sort of drip email campaign sequences and do it manually. Or if you are using automation software, throttle that down. Especially if you're using a brand new domain, to kind of warm up that domain and warm up your system, because there's nothing worse. And it can even be like demotivating if you blast out like hundreds and hundreds and you get lots of negative responses just emotionally, even though that's to be expected. Emotionally, that can kind of take all the air out of what you're doing. So I would suggest that you start this as you're learning and as you're trying some of these techniques, start it out in sort of a small methodical way and just sort of test some of these techniques before you get your system defined. And then you can kind of scale up from there. All right. Okay, so here's goes to timing. So a lot of times people ask me, when should I send out my emails? This has kind of always been my rule of thumb. I like Thursdays, I like Tuesdays. Nobody likes their Monday. They kind of go into the office generally either tired, overwhelmed, upset, or there's just lots of things going on Mondays. And so you can be an irritant if you come into the inbox on Mondays. And then Fridays, sometimes this just irritates people, right? On Friday, they're ready to kind of get out. They're ready to finish up and go to their weekend. Their mind's already somewhere else. Even if they were interested in what you're doing, their mind's probably not going to be as effective for you. So, so Mondays and Fridays, I like to not play with those. Interestingly enough, Saturdays and Sundays can be quite effective, just kind of depending on what industry you are and the way that you position your email and your copy. So Saturdays and Sundays, if you acknowledge that it's a Saturday and Sunday and you build that into your process, you can have some really effective sort of campaigning strategies that take advantage of Saturdays and Sundays. A lot of times people have more time or they're in a better state of mind. So testing Saturdays and Sundays, I always suggest, can be super effective. Keep in mind, this is why short works, or kind of breaking the text up in a good way, because most of the emails that you will send will get read on the mobile phone. Anywhere from 75 to 80 is probably the percentage that will be read on the mobile phone. So when you're testing, look at it on your mobile phone. Sometimes a lot of these emails, even some of the ones that I showed you, are too long. They'll just be a wall of text and will never get read. So make sure that you kind of break those down into smaller things. Make it look as personal as possible. That's why I don't do any HTML. I don't put images in it generally, just kind of straight text. So that's one of the ways to make it look personal without having to do a lot of personalization. Systemize your response. This is super important. You know that you're going to get certain categories of responses, so go ahead and build out those templates so that you don't have to manually write back to every response you get, but you should reply to every response that you get. And that acknowledges and helps to improve kind of your domain standing and that sort of thing. So go ahead and write templates for these different types of responses. All right, next steps. If you want to get started, these are the exact next steps. Get a cheap piece of software. Most of the software are very affordable, less than less than probably $50 a month. You can get a good solid drip email automation platform. This is kind of the best way to get started. And again, throttle it down. Do only a few every single day. Don't get greedy. Write only 3 emails, a 3-step sequence, because otherwise, if you try to write these complex, I've actually been in this scenario where I try to write these overly complex, all different twists and turns, end up with 20, 50 different emails, and it just takes a lot of time and you kind of never get started. So just write 3 emails, put them in a sequence, drop it into your automation. This is where I suggest you get your first set of data instead of sort of going out there and doing something where you don't know much about the data or you spend a lot of money on it. Just go into your database of past clients or past leads or old leads that you've worked on and you've touched or somehow come in contact with you. Pull a segment out of your CRM and go ahead and load them up into this sequence and see if you can, and use some of kind of those those old, warm-up techniques, cold techniques that I showed you in the slides. Try some of those on people that are familiar with your brand or with you specifically. So again, a lot of times your organization will load you up with a little bit of a book of business or some old leads that nobody else wants to touch in the organization, or you've just got some people that for whatever reason have been unresponsive to you. Go ahead and try some of these techniques on that group because it'll help you. They'll have some familiarity. You'll have some success with that for sure. Send those 3 emails slowly over the next 3 weeks. I probably wouldn't get more than 1 a week in that sequence. So space them out at least a week apart, probably not too much further than that. And then get the information, right? Don't review it, improve it, and do it again. And don't give up. You're going to get some negative feedback, and that can be demotivating. That can be frustrating. That can cause you some anxiety a lot of times. Try to push through that and just try to figure out, okay, how can I kind of improve this and get the process to work? Because it will work, but it's going to take a little bit of tuning. All right, Q&A. We're going to launch into this, and we'll do it for the next 5 to 10 minutes, depending on how many questions. So if you do have a question, either hit me up in chat or in the Q&A, and I will answer as many of these as I can. So let me take a look here real quick to see what we've got. Just reiterating, yes, there will be a recording. Link the message, just definitely a testing process. I would always start with short and then potentially go to long. I'm going to be using text messaging. So I love text messaging. I will caution you, there are all kinds of rules around text messaging, so make sure that you're following that. I have had enormous success with text messaging, particularly in the mortgage industry. One of the reasons I think this is so effective is because whereas, especially during the day, whereas a phone call is an interruption and a frustration, a text message, a lot of people think that is sort of offensive or interrupting or whatever, but I found that a lot of clients appreciate that because it actually doesn't interrupt anything they're doing. They can either ignore it or they can text back to it. A lot of times my text message are something like, hey, I'd like to reach out to you. When is a good time? And that text message has really been effective. Or, hey, I got your request for a quote. When's the best time to reach out to you? And I get all kinds of great response to that. They give me a time and sort of set up a pseudo appointment. So I think that's a great strategy. Also want to use email drip campaigns. Do you see the approach is similar? Yeah, I mean, there's some great call action. Actually, is a friend of mine in the kind of has a lot of real estate, but I think there's mortgage and insurance in his, again, that's callaction.co, I think. And he allows you to, one, kind of step through the process of getting people to opt in correctly into text messaging, and then setting up that campaigning concept with text messaging. So that's becoming more and more prevalent. Just again, make sure that you follow the rules and make sure that you do it in a really kind of a considerate way. So I think that text messaging will be super effective. Yeah, my open rates and response rates, again, not to drift off into text messaging, we could talk this for a long time, has been higher than email. One of the things that's distinguishing about text messaging, I can't say enough, follow the rules, follow the rules, follow the rules. But with text messaging is, unlike email, there's not this ability to kind of segment and things get pushed around in there. And so as a result of that, you're going to get almost 100% deliverability. So that software was, I'm going to kind of type it in here for you specifically, Mike, but it's call action, if I can type, callaction.co, I believe, call action. Access to the slides. Yes, I'll actually post these to SlideShare and give a link into our email, to everybody that signed up. I have your email, so I'll send it out, a link to the posting on SlideShare. We will also have this webinar available through the, again, I'll send it out through the email. We'll probably also post it on YouTube if you haven't gotten onto the YouTube channel and subscribed there, we're putting out all kinds of live training content that I do. Sometimes I get up on the whiteboard and kind of do that. So encourage you to seek out the Age Lead Store YouTube channel. There's a lot of other stuff there. And we'll constantly do more of these webinars. Any other questions? Love to, we'll probably be sending out, I think I can do this, kind of a post webinar critique. So I'd love to know what you liked, what you want to hear next, because we're going to try to make this kind of an every 2 weeks thing, so that we can actually kind of live work through a lot of different sales and marketing concepts and opportunities, everything from cold calling to email, to one of the videos that I did just recently was kind of structuring your sales day, and how I kind of maximize my productivity without sort of dialing for dollars all day long, which is actually a counterproductive way to do sales. So again, you can check that out. Any other questions? I'll give it one more minute here, and then we'll go ahead and close it down. Thanks everybody for attending. Super awesome crowd, and let your friends in your office know that we're going to do this. And again, give me as much feedback as possible as to what you want to hear about, because I love to do this kind of training and would like to be of as much support and assistance as I can. Any last questions? All right, I'm gonna let you guys go. We're gonna close this up. Thank you guys for being here and being such a great audience, and we'll do this again in a couple weeks. Watch your email for the next webinar and give me feedback on what you want to hear, and we'll build up the training for you guys. All right, have a great one.